Thank you very much, Sally. Hi everybody. So my name is Jerome Billeter. I'm the corporate business manager at the HousingLIN. So I'm really delighted to welcome you all today to the first session of our autumn-winter series of Happy Hour, which is our regular webinars, which are sponsored by the UKRI. So after a short summer break, we're really excited to host this session on the very important subject of planning for an aging population. And we are hosting today's session with our long-term friends and supporters at Winkworth Sherwood. And in today's session, we're going to take a look at the current issues facing developers and local authorities and consider whether there's a need for clear national guidance and tools to plan and deliver more housing for our aging population. So this session is also supported by a great cast of speakers from leading global real estate services firm Cushman & Wakefield, and also from the Manchester School of Architecture, who will present on their research and forthcoming report on creating age-friendly developments for an age-inclusive city. Just a reminder, as Sally said in her introduction, please make sure to post lots of questions in the Q&A box. These are really helpful. They help create an interesting conversation between our speakers in the last slot of the session. Okay, so without further ado, I will now hand over to Charlotte Cook, who is partner in the social housing arm of the real estate team at Winkworth Sherwood, who is going to chair today's session. So over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much indeed, Jerome. Thank you very much, Sally, for that introduction there. And welcome to everybody online for the first in the autumn series of the Happy Hour sessions. As Jerome has kindly introduced me, my name's Charlotte Cook. I'm a partner in the social housing real estate team at Winkworth Sherwood. Not a sales thing, but we are a law firm. We're based in London with offices in Oxford and Manchester, and we cover all aspects of the housing sphere, from construction and development, planning, residential plot sales, policy advice, tenancies, occupational management, health and social care, as well as advice across the board. And we work with all manner of people within the sector, housing associations, local authorities, charities, developers, and pretty much everybody in between. We've been working with the HousingLIN, as Jerome says, for many years. Really pleased to continue to be able to support them in the Happy Hour series here. These are always a fabulous source of information for all concerned, and indeed for us. It's really great to see what everybody else is doing out there and to be able to interject and see how it all fits in together. I'm sure today is going to be a fabulous session as well. Sorry that Jeremy can't make it today. He's on a well-deserved sabbatical. So I'm wearing a number of hats, but helped, of course, by Jerome and Sally here as well. As Jerome said, we're looking here at things leading on from the Older Persons Housing Task Force, seeking to better understand the older persons housing market and what mechanisms could best boost the supply of housing for older people. And we're looking here at how planning particularly can help to achieve those goals. As Jerome says, three illustrious speakers with me today. So Millie Todd from Cushman & Wakefield, talking to their latest report on housing for an ageing population. Dr. Mark Hammond from the Manchester School of Architecture, looking at the creation of age-friendly developments. And one of my colleagues, Matthew Steinbrecher, who is a senior associate in our planning department, looking at latest experiences in planning matters. And of course, today, really timely, we are fast approaching International Older Persons Day, which will take place on the 1st of October. Although apparently today is National Speak Like a Pirate Day. So I will expect each of my presenters to throw in a couple of ooh-ah me hearties during their presentations. Setting the scene as to why we're here today then. Our speakers will be looking at people and at place, how best to plan from a planning point of view for an ageing population. We all know the demographics, the rise in the ageing population, and certainly many people living longer and living better. But does that mean, well, I'm suggesting it does not mean that we need to rest on our laurels here. Much work still to be done to ensure that accommodations that we can either deliver, retrofit, or develop for the ageing population is appropriate and practicable. Number of different offerings out there: retirement housing, care homes, retirement communities, standalone, integrated with other types of developments. one of the questions we'll be looking at today is whether there should be a change through national or more local policies as regards the provision of appropriate housing for all members of the community, and of course some lessons learned from developments going forward. As Jerome and Sally said, do please put questions into the Q&A box, put some comments into the chat. We'll use those to inform a discussion after our speakers have spoken. So as such, with little more ado, if I can hand over to Millie as our first presenter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my slides. So today I'm going to talk you through our latest research report that Cushman & Wakefield did joint with the British Property Federation. So this report looks to sort of discuss the senior living market. So why is this such an important topic? Well, today in the UK, there are 12.9 million over 65s, and this is set to reach 16.9 million by 2040. And at the same time, we have a well-documented shortfall of age-appropriate homes. So there are 603,000 senior living units in the UK, which only house about 5.6% of our over 65 population. So it's essential that the government prioritise the development of senior housing. And that will enable older people to live healthy, happier lives for longer. And it has wider benefits. It will improve affordability in the general housing market and relieve some of that pressure on our social care and healthcare systems. So in April 2023, the government announced the Older People's Housing Task Force, and this is something Cushman & Wakefield and the BPF lobbied for in our 2020 report. And this report sets out some recommendations for that task force, which I will go through later on. So moving on to sort of what I mean by senior housing, just for those who are quite new to the sector or don't quite understand my definitions when I go through this research. We have stuck to ARCO's definitions, and they've worked really hard on those over the last couple of years. So retirement housing, the new name for sort of housing with support, is purpose-built, self-contained flats or bungalows with limited communal facilities. They quite often provide some support and in some cases very limited care services. Whereas integrated retirement communities, so the new terminology for housing with care. And these allow older people the opportunity to live independently in their own home or as part of a wider community. And lifestyle well-being and care services are very much at the forefront of this and allow older people to still live independent, aspirational lives. And then we have care homes. And for our research, this is kept separately. We sort of view this very much as healthcare rather than those senior living options. So what does the UK market look like today? Well, there are 603,000 senior housing units, but the majority of this, 85%, is that retirement housing, which has limited sort of healthcare supports within that. And only 15% are integrated retirement communities. Now, these integrated retirement communities cater for a greater range of older people's needs, but there just isn't a great range of those products available. And in fact, of that sort of 88,000 integrated retirement community units, 78% of that market is public and voluntary, so a huge chunk. But the majority of that, like 88%, is rental. And a lot of that rental public and voluntary stock is much older, and it was actually developed sort of early 2000s. And that's somewhere we really think the government need to focus on retrofitting that, investing in it and bringing it up to today's standards. And then if we just have a little look at the private market, this only makes up 22% of integrated retirement communities. And unlike the public and voluntary sector, majority of that private stock is for sale. So actually 93% of private IRCs are available for sale. And today in the UK, we only have 1,400 operating private rental IRCs. So really few units available for rent. So what our report really pushes is for the government to ensure that senior living is delivered, but catering for a range of everyone's needs, and particularly that everyone's financial needs, because everyone is in a different place. So how is delivery doing? So we had a look at the historic pipeline, and as you can see, a lot of stock was built pre-1990. And in fact, 87% of senior housing stock in the UK today was built pre-2010. And that is all of varying quality and efficiency, and something the sector needs to address. So we've got sort of a big retrofit sustainability challenge on our hands there. And then over the last 20 years, you can see deliveries remained pretty stagnant. And in fact, delivery over the last decade has only increased by 5%. So despite, I think, everyone talking about our aging population and the need to address this, those delivery numbers aren't matching. And we currently deliver 6,271 units a year, which around 3,700 are integrated retirement communities. So we need to increase this delivery to match demand. Now, I'm sure this chart is something everyone's very familiar with. This is our sort of growing elderly population in the UK. So 19.1% of the UK's population is over 65 today, and that will reach 27% in 2060, which is 19 million. So if you think of that 603,000 units, there's just a huge supply-demand imbalance. So in order to understand what we do need to be delivering, we've sort of modelled three delivery scenarios. So in this model, we've assumed supply and occupancy of elderly nursing and care homes remains constant, that an average number of people in a sort of a general household over 65 is 1.5, and that occupancy rates in senior housing is at 90%, and on average 1.3 people live in each senior housing unit. And so we put all that into our model, and then we've also taken our ONS projections, and then we've plugged in 3 different delivery rate scenarios. So scenario A is continue as we are. So we continue to deliver 6,300 units a year up until 2040. And if we do that, only 5% of over 65s will be living in senior housing. So it's a very similar, if not lower figure than today. Scenario B, we deliver 20,000 senior housing units a year up until 2040. And that will increase the number of over 65s living in senior housing to 7%. And it will release 197,000 standard homes back into the housing market, so helping improve that affordability. And then scenario C, the most favourable scenario, is delivering 50,000 senior housing units a year. And that would mean by 2040, 11% of over 65s will be living in senior housing. And it will release an astonishing 628,000 standard houses back into the mainstream market. So really releasing those homes to families and helping improve that affordability. So the BPF committee and its members, as well as the Mayhew Review, all recommend the government adopt a 50,000 senior housing unit target a year. So as you can see, there is that huge supply-demand imbalance in the sector, and that is what's attracting investors. That, as well as the non-cyclical inflation hedging nature of the sector, and the social agenda that's very much on investors' minds. And therefore, Cushman & Wakefield estimate that there's 6.5 billion capital waiting to be deployed into the UK senior living market. But there are challenges in the way that's sort of stopping that investment happening. So I'm just going to lightly talk about these because I know we're going to dive into them much more on our panel and with our other speakers. But in our report, we outlined 4 key challenges. So policy. I think the pandemic really highlighted the misalignment between our healthcare, social care and housing systems. And we really need the task force to align these. Planning reform is essential if we're to deliver more senior housing. Senior housing needs its own planning use class, CR2. all local plans need to assess housing needs for their ageing population, and ideally using the same methods. There's a consistent approach across the country. And that a proportion of all new housing should be allocated to seniors. We then touch on sentiment. So by sentiment, we sort of mean consumer understanding. And there has been some improvement in the sector, but we still have a long way to go until we're like an aspirational market, similar to New Zealand or Australia. And I think the more senior housing we deliver and the more older people understand the products available to them, the more that sentiment will increase. And then our final challenge is house builders. So we really need to encourage house builders to diversify their exit routes and not just deliver the traditional private sales homes. And I think the market, how it is today, and the end of Help to Buy is really helping accelerate this sort of change in mindset. And our report ended with 4 key recommendations, and we did also have a 12-month plan of how the task force could achieve this. Our 4 recommendations: number 1, an independent report. An independent report should be produced setting out the national strategy for housing our ageing population. Planning reform is essential. The task force should ensure seniors housing is granted its own planning use class. All local plans need to identify older people's housing needs, and a proportion of all new homes needs to be allocated to seniors. Transparency. The task force should continue to drive transparency within the sector, providing clear consumer, operator, and investor guidelines. And then finally, facilitate investment. The government needs to facilitate investment into the seniors housing market, and priority should be given to projects that exhibit commitment to achieving the UK's zero carbon ambition. So that's it from me today. So I'm going to hand back over to Charlotte.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Millie. All very interesting. Lots of comments going into the chat, which is brilliant to see. I'll try and pick up as many of those as possible when we go into our Q&A session, but do feel free otherwise, if you've got particular questions or queries you'd like to raise, that those go into the Q&A session. But I'm keeping an eye on both of those, so do continue. So lots of ideas there from Millie. Matthew, handing over to you from the planning and practice side of things. Would you like to speak to this shifting mindset? And you are on mute.
I've got someone had to do it. Yeah. Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, I'm just going to spend the next few minutes talking about kind of what we're seeing across national policy, local plans coming forward, and then some recent appeal decisions in terms of the themes that are coming out from the Planning Inspectorate. I've titled it perhaps flippantly a shifting mindset, but we can all kind of reach our own conclusions at the end, perhaps, where we may feed into the discussion. So just taking a step back slightly into where we are in terms of national policy, we've obviously got the NPPF consultation that is out there at the moment. There is a hat tip to an amendment in the revised NPPF where there is, I think, an acknowledgement of older persons housing being made up of certain different characteristics. But other than that, there isn't really much else in there. And we've obviously had the NPPG, the National Planning Practice Guidance, in there since 2019 with a recognition that there is a critical need. And that is then perhaps feeding its way through into the revised NPPF. Consultation is closed. We haven't had any revisions, save for some of you may have seen the other week where it was released to much excitement, but only to find out that it was about onshore wind farms changes and not really housing related. So we still await an updated NPPF in that sense. Coupled with that, we do have the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill that is progressing through Parliament, and there are recent Lords debate, as I've just put a couple of extracts in there, showed that older persons housing is on the agenda in that sense as the Levelling Up bill comes through. There's an acknowledgement that there is a need for it, that there we've got reference here to top-down targets, which I'll come on to when I look at development plans. But ultimately, there is a cross-party recognition that there needs to be greater facilitating of older persons housing from a planning aspect. Looking at the development plan side of it then, and I'll come to some recent local plans that have been adopted and how they're dealing with it. But as part of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, I just wanted to touch upon a slight shift into how perhaps applications will be determined moving forward, and the weight that is going to be given to local plans and national policies, because at the moment we've got a statutory test when looking at a planning application that you must determine that in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. We've got a slight amendment in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, as I've highlighted there, with an additional reference to any national development management policies. At the moment, that's effectively what the NPPF is working as, and then unless material considerations strongly indicate otherwise. So I think there is an opportunity perhaps for national development management policies, as and when these creatures come into effect, to perhaps guide and support older persons housing from a national top-down level, that I think we saw the phraseology from the House of Lords comments on the previous slide. Certainly the view is that national development management policies are going to be quite a useful tool, and I think the Centre for Cities recent approach, I was reading the other week, effectively says that the national development policies is a key aspect of reform from the government's point of view. But to date, we haven't really had any detail, and if anything, they've pointed to the other way in terms of not necessarily setting nationally important issues, more dealing with local design issues and things. So there perhaps may be a missed opportunity there. When we then drill down beyond national development management policies to local policies, I've just highlighted a few things that are coming through. At the moment, I think the uncertainty surrounding the NPPF's progress, the Levelling Up Regeneration Bill, is having an impact on local plans coming forward. Certain authorities are halting the local plan process whilst sort of the NPPF works its way through, but there are some coming through, so I'll touch on those in a minute. But from a strategic point of view, we've got the London plan that we often encounter, where in the adopted London plan from 2021, it recognises that there is a need for about 4,000 units of older person housing per year between 2017 and 2029. There is a recognition in the London plan that is like the rate of need is likely to increase, but not necessarily at the rate that it has. So between 2029 and 2041, whilst that need will continue to increase, it's considered that that's going to be at a slower rate. So from a strategic level, we've got an example of a regional policy document setting a global figure. If we drill down a bit further, we've got recent adopted local plans in Wandsworth and Islington, both London boroughs, which adopt effectively that London plan target and what has been set for them in terms of annual requirements within a borough for older persons housing. If I take Norfolk, for example, they recently submitted their new local plan to the Secretary of State. At a county level, Norfolk needs circa 3,000 units by 2028, specifically for older persons housing. Within Norfolk's local plan, they have 640-ish allocated for their plan period. So they're expecting to contribute to some of that. But again, it's only a part need that appears to be being met. And similarly, in Crawley, again, that's a recent submission, but there's some allocated sites, but they only total 115 dwellings. So we are finding that certainly if you looked at sort of the policy position where we've got the government saying local plans should set targets, whilst there is perhaps a hat tip at the moment, it's not necessarily reflecting the need that many in the reports identified. So I think that still is a work in progress that needs to come through. What is interesting to note, I would say, just in terms of the Crawley one, is that the use class is a sort of debate that often happens with older persons housing. The policy position in Crawley's proposed local plan is that whether it's C2 or C3, there will be an affordable requirement. So there is sometimes, I think, the debate that C3 would trigger on, but C2 doesn't. But actually, there's a recognition that irrespective of whether the use class is C2 or C3, you will get an affordable housing requirement triggered from that. And then finally, just before I hand over to Mark, I wanted to just pick out a few appeal decisions which have come through in the last sort of 6 to 8 months, just in terms of the themes that we're seeing from the planning inspectorate. So I have, as I say, the 3 that I've listed here are actually all decisions within Wokingham Borough Council, but they were all decided by separate inspectors. But again, we're all for older persons housing. So what we are finding, or certainly the themes that are coming out from the appeal decisions, that there is a conflict at the moment between recognising that there is a significant need for older persons housing, but that is being weighed up against in the balance by inspectors and from the planning inspectorate against harm to, for example, character and appearance or issues of design. And I think that is aligned with what we are seeing perhaps from government and the inspectorate as a whole, that there is a greater impetus or focus on design and harm to character and appearance that perhaps is the predominant theme, rather than there being a need that trumps design. I mean, for example, in the Shinfield one, it was a C2 development, but the inspector noted that although there is a significant need for older persons housing within the area, that doesn't mean that local and national design policies, they don't apply. And they actually gave them full weight in the planning balance, recognising that the need for older persons housing is a complex situation, that it requires different needs, a different assessment of needs. I mean, the Shinfield one was in February. The golf club one I've put there is more recent, in August. But again, there was an acknowledgement that whilst there was a significant need for older persons housing in the borough, the building itself created some harm on the character and appearance of the area, and the design wasn't quite there. So there was that, to say that just sort of the theme of design against need feeding into appeal decisions. And there was one last week, which I haven't put on the slide, but it's popped up, and that was a retirement living one in Cheshire East. Interestingly, within that decision, there was a slight dispute as to whether it was C2 or C3 housing in terms of how things were assessed. So that debate is still ongoing. But again, whilst the need was recognised, there was still harm in terms of character and appearance, and ultimately that was given full weight against some of the other issues. But having said that, there were transport items as well that the inspector found conflicted or outweighed the recognition of the need. But the point the inspector had was that, you know, the design aspects, the character and appearance impacts in line with national policies, and it goes back to that national policies point. The theme from a national level still being very much well designed, beautiful places hasn't yet perhaps picked up that there is the need for older persons housing that tips the balance slightly the other way. And that, I think, is where I've, you know, I mentioned it before, perhaps where national development management policies have the scope to champion older persons housing at that level, and something that we may see as and when they come through.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'll hand back.
Yeah, I didn't think we'd escape the C2, C3 discussion.
Well,
lovely. Thank you very much indeed. That was really, really useful, and some really useful comments in the chat, which we'll pick up on later. Just so the C2, C3, it's fun and games for everybody. So C3 being dwelling houses, and C2 the residential accommodation for people in need of care, and it's a big dispute as to what you're paying, you know, what you're providing for there, and also the implications of that for individual residents and occupiers. Without further ado, Mark, handing over to you as our final speaker before we go into the chat. So unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
Oh, almost. Thanks for the warning. Great. Let me just share my screen. And here we go. Great. Well, lovely to be invited back, and great to see some familiar faces in the chat. So today I'm going to be talking about a document that myself and kind of colleagues and collaborators at the GM Aging Hub have been working on for a good while now, called Creating Age-Friendly Developments. Now, it's not quite out yet. It's going to be released on International Day of Older People. But I thought I'd talk through a little bit about kind of what is in the guide, but mostly about kind of the process by which we actually came together to create it. Because I think, in contrast to some of the other presentations today, we're taking a very carrot-based approach rather than stick-based approach to supporting age-friendly homes. Apologies for that sound. That was my son falling over on the kitchen floor. Perfectly timed. Do you want to go and see your sister? No? Okay. Well, I'll persevere. So,
shout if you need, Mark, and we can hand over to some
okay,
questions.
that's all right. Ezra, do you want to take that to your sister, please? He's at that age where you give him a job and he'll do it. So, okay. You can sit and watch.
Hello.
So this is something that happens quite a lot to me. I get invited to a meeting, I'm speaking to someone from local government or a developer, and they've heard about this age-friendly idea from somewhere. They're usually not a specialist developer. They're, you know, working on a big kind of 10,000 home regeneration program in Manchester, and they say, so when you say age-friendly, you know, what do you actually want us to do? Just tell us what you need us to do, and we'll do it, or we won't do it, depending on if we can afford it or not. And I usually go, well, today I'd go, yar, well, and then I'd talk at them for a really long time, because I'm really enthusiastic about it. I think it's really exciting, but there's also so many ways that you can think about age-friendly. There's so many different kind of attitudes. Yeah, that's me on the bottom corner. So it's one of the real challenges with the age-friendly world. It's a big tent. It's a really positive. It brings lots of people in. But when people are inside the tent, sometimes it's a bit unclear what the tent was for in the first place. So, luckily, in Greater Manchester at least, we've got the GM Aging Hub. I was finding that these conversations where I was having with developers, where I was, you know, hopefully at the end of it, they were coming out knowing a little bit more about aging. They maybe opened their horizons a little bit. But fundamentally, I didn't feel like I'd given them enough to actually take forward into this next stage. So I was speaking to colleagues at the GM Aging Hub, and they agreed. They said, yeah, we have the same conversations. You know, people ask me, you know, policymakers get asked, you know, plans get asked, what do you mean by age friendly? And it's sometimes really hard to pin it down. Obviously, there's some great guidance around from places like the HousingLIN, and looking backwards in time towards some of the great central government guidance. But it was difficult to really kind of move the needle. So one of the things we did as part of the GM Aging Hub is set up the Housing Planning and Aging Group. This is a multidisciplinary kind of task group within the GM Aging Hub, containing various people within the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, but also academics, developers, representatives from the HousingLIN and Centre for Ageing Better, a couple of housing associations, the GM Older People's Network, and importantly, some kind of commercial architects and some commercial property developers. So this was really trying to get a really broad set of understandings and opinions and insight into this world around this core vision about how we improve the quality and the quantity of homes for older people within Greater Manchester. Okay, so one of the things that came up in response to this question of what do you want us to do, we decided, okay, there is a bit of a gap here that we think we can fill, particularly in the kind of non-specialist sector. These kind of mainstream developers who, you know, in Greater Manchester at least, are doing huge 10,000 property developments at a time, and you know they don't have, you know, specialist housing providers involved in their decision making. What's our offer to them? What's the discussion with them about age friendly? So the guide aims to offer a list of age-friendly considerations for architects, planners, and developers to consider when creating new or retrofitting existing urban redevelopments, ensuring that we're producing places where everyone can age in place. So the real aspiration behind this isn't around how we create more specialist housing necessarily, although we recognize that as an important component of it, but how you can integrate ideas of age inclusivity into every single development that is getting created. Yeah. So there's some really great comments in the chat earlier in this meeting about things like older people's co-housing or aging in place. And we see what we're doing as something contributing to that and moving that discussion towards some of those directions. Okay. So it's this idea that, you know, fundamentally every scheme, every development should be age inclusive in some way, recognizing the really diverse sets of needs and aspirations in later life, how these change over time, and the importance of thinking about what we're creating, not just today, but 50 years in the future. So what we're seeing broadly within urban development is this age segregation of cities. And I think you can look at it in relation to what is being developed. We're seeing an awful lot of properties, particularly in urban cores, which are very purposely designed for a certain audience. And there's surely got to be a better way. And luckily, we're seeing in Greater Manchester, kind of the development partners we work with also recognizing that's an issue that they should be, you know, think about addressing, not just because of the moral imperative behind it, but also because potentially there's, you know, a common good or some profit to be made by taking that kind of approach. We were really conscious putting the guide together that we didn't want to make a checklist. I think what the developers who came to talk to us wanted was a checklist, but when we tried to produce it, we always felt that it overly limited things down. So there are a lot of things to do in our guide, things that we think developers should be doing. Sometimes it's about characteristics of homes and neighborhoods, but often it's about processes. It's about how to include people, when to include people, why you would include people. But critically, I think what it does, it opens up ways of thinking. So it requires that creativity. It requires developers and architects and planners to really understand how the issues that they face in their place can be addressed by thinking about age in a slightly different or nuanced way. We think this is really important, talking within the Housing Planning and Aging Group, that there is that opportunity for people to really bring themselves to this work. We know that for this work to get embedded into policy and practice, you know, giving someone the opportunity to apply it to the situation they're facing and take ownership over it is really important for those ideas sticking and not getting kind of filtered out when times get tough or the budget gets cut. So like I said, I'm not really going to go through the content of the guide today just because of brevity, but there are broadly three sections. One of them is about the role older people have in development itself. It's about ensuring that architects, planners, and developers are making conscious efforts to understand older people, to talk to older people, to include them as active participants in their schemes, be that through more traditional things like market research, or potentially more excitingly through ideas like co-production. The second section is about planning for age-friendly neighbourhoods. This is about like this kind of neighbourhood scale, recognising in Greater Manchester, the audience is often these kind of really big development programmes, about what the housing mix looks like if you're talking about regenerating North Manchester, about what the social infrastructure would need to look like to be age inclusive, about all of these ideas around natural environment. Now, often a lot of these things we see in other reports. They're not unique to the ageing world. They sometimes, you know, there are loads of great documents across various sectors about just cities and active travel and all of these things. And we're not trying to take ownership over any of them. We're just trying to suggest that, you know, actually for a lot of people, these other concerns that are already at the front of your mind, they are part of creating an age inclusive community. And perhaps you just need to tweak your thinking a little bit in order to really unpack something transformative. Finally, around designing age-friendly homes. So this is the kind of nuts and bolts of kind of what is being proposed, you know, inside the home, but with a real focus on kind of social life and the diversity of life that comes with that. Okay, and this image on the right is from a project we've been working with Potsoni Architecture in North Manchester with a developer and one of the housing trusts around a vision for an age-inclusive, healthy neighbourhood, which maybe I'll come back to a happy hour and talk about sometime next year when hopefully something's got signed off. So reflecting on the process, you know, one of the really exciting things about creating this guide was all of these different sets of expertise that were involved in curating it. You know, having that for-profit developer being, you know, the angel and the devil on our shoulders was really positive, because they were able to unpick when I was being overly academic or when my colleagues, yeah, there you go, do you want to take that to your sister? Apologies. The second point is this long gestation process. You know, as a group, we've been together for about 3 years. We've been having kind of every couple of months, we'd have one of these 2-hour meetings where, you know, we'd have these really great discussions, and we would all come to this common understanding around kind of what good looks like, or what needs to be done, or kind of how we take this next step. And we, in many ways, the document is just the summation of that 3-year journey, bringing together all the ideas that we developed over that period of time. I'd say this final bit, you know, when this guide was forming, you know, someone suggested in one of these meetings, oh, we should create a guide, and someone said, yeah, that sounds great, we've got no money, who's going to do it? What I would say is, you know, so myself and Kelly Rogers from Greater Sport, who kind of did an awful lot of work in the kind of the checklist section of it. We're both in roles which really value impact. So as an academic, if we were able to demonstrate that what we're doing is doing something good, my bosses like me, and they give me more time to do interesting research. Same with Kelly Rogers. What we found as academics is a lot of people don't realize this about what we do. So what I would suggest is, if you're interested in doing any kind of work around age friendly, do go and reach out to your friendly neighborhood academics. If there's an opportunity for it to do some good, we're probably going to bite your hand off. Rose may disagree with this. You know, I'm sure she is constantly getting harassed to do various reports and guides and things, but certainly for someone at my career stage, it was an utter thrill to be able to do something like this. So thank you. Like I said, the guide isn't out for another few weeks, but I believe I'm due to write a blog for HousingLIN about it, and I'm sure it will find its way into one of the HousingLIN newsletters very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll promote it as soon as it's available.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Great. Well, that's me done. Thank you very much for your time.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And I think we'll also intergenerational living in progress there, Mark, with your various co-contributors to your presentation there. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for speaking. They're really, really useful, really, really interesting. And of course, there is much debate going on in the chat with a couple of questions in the Q&A. Just to pick up a couple of those, really interesting question asked before we dive into some of the other bits and pieces. Matt, what is the planner's role in all of this, or the inspector's role in the decision-making process? One of the questions is, are there common aspects of the character and appearance of older persons' housing that planners find so offensive? So what should a planner be looking at? And really, I suppose the question is, whose fault is this if we're not providing the accommodation that we need based upon demographics or similar? Is it for the inspector to say, yes, we need more of this housing, or we need more housing looking like something else?
It is an interesting point. I mean, the decisions that have kind of come out, it seems to be more about density and building footprint, for example, and that slightly feeds, I think, to viability and how older person's housing is treated in that way, because certainly some of the themes coming out were that it's not necessarily the internal designs of a building, for example, or anything like that. It is more the extent of a building that has to go up to make a older person's housing scheme work, perhaps, or make it suitable in terms of meeting a possible need. The design of those, be that external facade, be that height, as I say, footprint, often then kicks into play issues of land, effect on landscape, heritage aspects, possibly in terms of visuals and landscape amenity, and that might just be a luck of the draw as to where these types of buildings or communities can go, in that they are going to be in parts of the local authorities area where there is going to be that conflict created. And as I say, at the moment, I think the focus has been, or continues to be, slightly on well-designed, beautiful spaces and communities, and there probably needs to be a bit of work in terms of, well, what does that mean in terms of design from a development perspective. And I think that's the rub that inspectors are having to grapple with. They've got the MPPF and guidance from some of the calling decisions from Mr. Gove and his involvement and things, clearly focusing on well-designed places and beauty, coupled with the need for the land to become available for these communities to go into. So that's the balance that I think inspectors are having to weigh up when they look at a scheme. It is, yes, I recognise there is a need, but ultimately, what is before me in design terms is the struggle that is before me in terms of planning balance.
Thank you. Yes, I think always a challenge, as yes, and what you're providing and what it's going to look like. A question came up, I think, probably directed to Millie. Obviously, your older person's housing task force was looking at housing designed particularly for older people. In looking at that, to what extent did you ask questions of, or should we be asking questions of, the people to be housed there? So lots of questions, lots of bits and pieces in the chat as to what actually do older people want? Do they want to have a dedicated type of property that is designated for them, or are there greater desires to age in place, for example?
So I think it's around having product for everyone. So not every older person is going to want to be in a senior living home, whether that be retirement housing or integrated retirement community. But there is a need, and we can look to countries like New Zealand, Canada, Australia, where people are extremely happy living in them. There's waiting lists. And I think, so when we look at our delivery targets, even delivering 50,000 a year, that's only 11% of over 65s living in senior housing. And then you might want another proportion living in mixed generational, or some people staying in their own home. So I think the size of our aging population means there's space for everyone to live in what they need. And there has been lots of consumer research done out there on senior living homes, so a lot carried out by ARCO on what an integrated retirement community should have. And I think there is a need. It won't suit everyone's needs, but definitely demand for that.
Lovely, thank you. Obviously, provided people aren't going to buy things or rent things if it doesn't tick all of their boxes. I think it's very interesting there, the statistics that you were raising regarding the type of product which is made available in each of those different market areas. So from the private sector, mainly units for sale, and then from the social stroke affordable side, units being more predominantly for rent. And I know that we had previously done some time back, did some research with Jenny Pannell and various of her team, looking at the try before you buy product and extending the rented sector into the private developer field, which still looks not to be happening. So maybe that's something for them to consider there. So really quite interesting, lots of the conversations here about retrofitting, which I know is something that's impacting on many of the housing association providers with whom we work particularly, and obviously future proofing. Mark, do you want to add anything to those comments there? Aging in place obviously was one of your themes in your report.
Yes, well, actually, I've got an interesting case study that isn't part of the report, but I'm working on a different research project. We're working with a housing trust who own a kind of 1970s mid-rise tower block, which wasn't designed with any particular group in mind, but now has 75% of people living there aged over 50, 98% of them living alone. So we've been trying to use the North American model of a naturally occurring retirement community with the tenants to convert a ground floor flat into a community space and work with them to create a kind of integrated program that is led by tenants, but engages with external stakeholders. So I think there are some really interesting models around retrofit, which, frankly, I guess the elephant in all these rooms is that this is something that we're not going to be able to build our way out of. The idea that, even with all of these targets in 50 years' time, I don't know the number, but 90% of the houses which people live in will have already been built. So short of some miraculous new home building program that I don't think anyone can really foresee, retrofit is such an integral part. I think it's just really important that we don't recognizing it's important that we don't get overly focused on retrofit just from a climate perspective. I think it's such an opportunity for us to work with our colleagues within different sectors to take off sometimes our sectoral blinkers where we focus on aging and actually work with people across the board to do something for a broader good. So there's some really exciting work and research done by people like Ryan Woolrich around kind of aging and climate resilience at the moment. So if you work for a local authority, he may well have contacted you. If he has, make sure you get back to him.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Millie, one of the points I was really interested in your commentary regarding house builders and they're sort of changing their dynamics, changing their thrust. That now is there a desire, or are they being asked to move from developing for the first time buyer and getting people onto the property ladder? Are we seeing a policy shift to seeing developers and builders being pushed towards the developing for people at the other end of life?
I don't think it's driven by policy. I think it's probably awareness and sort of education around what senior living is. And we've sort of seen very similar in the build to rent sector as well. So it's just becoming aware of not just delivering the same sort of red brick first homes, and so people are diversifying the exit routes. And then the sort of, as build to rent has grown as quite like an operational rental product, it builds confidence in that senior living market, and people are looking to do different things.
Or a desire, if that's where the money is, and that's where the sales are going to occur. If that's a better market, now we're seeing, given latest economic forecasting with the drop in the value of house prices.
Absolutely, and I think that's where the Older People Task Force can sort of help direct that capital. So it is building the right products and making sure there's sort of really clear regulations, guidelines. So there are sort of rules, and that sort of links back to all of that planning again, making sure we're delivering the right products.
Well, thank you. And we've only got a few minutes left before we go to closing remarks. So Matthew, are you seeing any particular change in the type of work that you are seeing coming to you, appeals and decision making, from a different type, or are developers looking to branch out into other types of housing particularly?
Yeah, I think there is a recognition, certainly, that in terms of creating well-balanced communities, that there needs to be a move away from a traditional, be that rent or buy product for the first homes, or whatever we want to call it, at that end of the scale. Certainly that will ultimately be then dictated, I think, by the policy approach, because there will be applications that will go in that will have to be assessed against policy. Crawley is a good example, that irrespective of whether it's C3 or C2 use, there's an expectation to provide some affordable housing. So that removes immediately one sort of avenue, if you like, because it treats it the same, irrespective of whether it's older persons or retirement living or care home C2 in the traditional sense. So in that way, I think whilst we're not necessarily seeing it yet, there is a recognition that there will be that requirement coming down the track, I think, as certainly there is that top-down push from, be that the bill or be that NDMPs that I alluded to, that will in that sense dictate applications and the market, because there will be the policy support for older persons housing that effectively assist the planning process on schemes that for the house builders and developers bring forward.
Thank you very much. Just running through a couple of other comments in the chat, but really interesting there. Liz asking comments about animal companions. We're all very keen to see what's going to happen with the Renters Reform Bill at the moment, which is currently languishing, which the proposal there that residents would be allowed, there will be effectively a right to have a pet unless there's a good reason not to. So hopefully that change may be coming through there. Lots of really interesting comments about mixed communities, intergenerational living, how ensuring integration of communities, and to avoiding any form of age segregation, which I'm sure everybody will be very supportive that a balanced community is what we're looking for, subject to the provision of appropriate support and care to those in need. Some really interesting comments there about the age-friendly features which may assist those with younger people with disabilities and otherwise. Absolutely, and lots of good work I think being done there by many housing associations and many housing providers. A couple of comments here as to what we're developing and where we're developing it, for example, so particularly within centres of urban centres, whether the development thrust is much more towards development for the young professional market, as opposed to either family housing or housing for older people, or indeed housing for larger communities. I like the pirate flag. Thank you, Jay Gardner. Very good, very supportive for today. Lots of comments. I mean, always a conflict, I think, in intergenerational housing projects, and particularly the comment, Millie, and maybe this one to pass to you, regarding the comment that you made about people selling up to move to more appropriate, possibly seen as more appropriate housing, and what then happens to those properties sold in particular communities, the rural coastal community where Sandra lives, that sort of accommodation would not necessarily go back into the market, but would snapped up as a second home. I think that's something that happens many places. So really interesting comments there. Before we leave, could I ask each of you to give me a couple of summations here? Millie, do you want to kick off as you started?
I think it's brilliant listening to everyone's view and the stuff Mark has said and all the comments, I think it's key to just deliver a wide variety. So obviously I focused on the senior living, but all the other alternates, and making sure that all communities and regen projects we work on are inclusive of everyone.
Lovely, thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, I think I'd echo that really. It's been really interesting to see almost what is coming down the track. And I think there is, with all these things, it's sometimes like turning a big tanker, that hopefully the older person task force and some of the work that Mark is doing does then represent, or translate into, local policy, which then we see sort of filters down into the planning process. So that at the front end of it, we are seeing schemes come forward that, meet that significant need across the board.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, just echoing those points. I think, speaking to colleagues internationally, I think something we maybe miss in the UK is how strong we are in terms of partnership working and collaboration. Whenever I present the kinds of work that, not just that we do, but other people in the UK are doing, it always really surprises people internationally. And I think sometimes we look to Europe and say, oh, they've got this sorted. But actually, we have got real strengths in the UK. And I think we're knocking at the door of something really exciting, and hopefully we can break through in the next few years.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed to all of my speakers. I found this really fascinating as ever. Really interesting to see so much animated conversation in the chat going on as well. I think we'll all agree that there is no one size fits all to this, but yeah, a greater offering is obviously going to be better for everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Jerome, shall I leave you to wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. That was really a great session to kick off this new series. So lots of great information, great comments from the audience. So yeah, thank you, Charlotte, for chairing. Thank you to all our speakers. That was brilliant. Thank you for the audience for being so engaged. And yeah, just one last reminder to please complete the short feedback form that will appear on your screen when we close this session. And also a last quick note about the next session. So it will be just hot on the heels of International Day of Older Person on the 1st of October. We'll be holding a session on the 3rd of October, which will focus on technology. So we'll be sharing some of the emerging lessons from the Dunhill Medical Trust funded HAPPI projects and other things. So please book your place, and looking forward to seeing you on the next happy hour. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Take care.
much.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.